So proration means splitting the bill. Okay? You go to lunch with your buddy, go to lunch with a friend. Nobody wants anybody to pay the whole freight because it's, you're close friends or whatever. And so you pay your share of the bill and I pay my share of the bill. So far, so good? So what happens if you have to get up and leave, right? And I pay the bill. All right, so I've already paid it. I've paid it. So let's just say that I'm Rolf, and I paid the bill. And you're Sally, and you didn't pay the bill, but you said, hey, I don't have any cash now, I'll catch you later. So I've paid the bill, all right? Who owes who money? Who owes who money? All right? In fact, I'm going to do this a little bit differently. Let's say that Sally pays the entire bill, and Bob didn't have any cash. Who owes who money? Sally paid it. Bob didn't. It seems to me that Bob owes his fair share to Sally. Well, let's change the name. Let's change the name from Sally to Seller. Seller paid something. Whatever it is. All right? Seller paid something, and that it wasn't lunch, but maybe it was a bill or the taxes, and was for this whole period. Let's change Bill's name to Buyer. Who owes who? Seller paid something. They close on that date. Seller goes, yo, I paid for the whole month, let's say this time period is. You owe me for the time you owned the property, Buyer. And this can go the other way, my friends. This can totally go the other way. Here is Seller. Here is Buyer. Okay? Buyer gets hit with the trash bill for an entire month. Buyer bought the property on that day. So let's just say this is a month. And the buyer and seller closed on this day. So the buyer owns the property this time. The seller owns the property during that time. We clear? Buyer pays the trash bill, the trash hauling bill. Who owes who money? Buyer paid. So the seller owes the buyer money. How much? For this amount of the month. Boom. That's a proration. Some think it is either paid, we call this being paid in arrears. This is being called paid in advance. If something's paid in arrears by the buyer, the seller owes the buyer. If something's paid in advance by the seller, the buyer owes the seller. Think about it like lunch. I paid you money. You paid, I owe you money. Proration. I owe you my fair share. Proration. Certain costs are prorated, i.e. divided between the buyer and the seller as of the date of closing. I'm going to go back and show you one more thing before we get going. You're going to see this again. Tell them what I'm going to tell you. Tell them what I told you. Right there. So we'll have to know who owned the property the day of closing. They never do. You own it half a day. Hey, we closed at noon, so you own half a day. No, they don't do that. Practice or law or contract will determine who owned the property on the day of closing. All right? Let me back up and do this one more time. Clear that all up. So here is the month, right? Here's the buyer. Here's the seller. They close on this day. Let's say it's a 30-day month. 30-day month. They close on the 16th. 30-day month. Day of closing goes to the seller. How many days did the seller own the property? From day 1 to day 16, day of closing goes to the seller, and the seller owns the property 16 days. Then how many days did the buyer own the property? Well, 30 minus 16 is 14 last time I checked. So now we know seller owned the property for 16 days, buyer owned the property for 14 days. If something was paid by the seller, buyer owes the seller. For how much? For 14 days worth of whatever the charge is. What if something was paid by the buyer? Well, if the buyer paid, seller owes the buyer. How much? 16 days worth. Okay? So that's how this song goes. Let's take a look once again at our materials then. Certain costs are prorated, divided between the buyer and the seller as of the date of closing. Things that you might bump into, such as property taxes, utilities, homeowners association dues, and rents for income property. So the seller of a rental property received rents, buyer buys the property in the middle of the month and says, yo, I'd kind of like a half month's rent, please. So we have to prorate it. Now, you and I aren't going to prorate it. All right, it's going to happen at the closing table, but you and I have to understand it and get an idea so we can do some buyer's net calculations and seller's net calculations prior to closing. So we're going to have to get close. You're going to need this if you're taking a test. So if the seller paid items in advance, calculate the amount owed by the buyer. Seller pays, buyer owes, and vice versa. If the buyer pays something, that's called in arrears, the buyer pays something, seller owes the buyer, just like we've talked about. All right, in that case, we'd have to calculate the amount the seller owes the buyer. Remember, the party that paid the expense is going to receive a credit. A party that is going to pay the expense is going to receive a credit. I'm going to go back up one more time to this extraordinary drawing. Clear it up. Seller, buyer. Closing date. Seller pays. How will it show up? Closing statement. Seller paid, but we're not at the closing table. Seller paid sometime gone by. Come to the closing table. So right now, seller paid. How will it show up on the closing statement? If the seller paid in advance, who owes who money? If the seller paid in advance, the buyer owes the seller money for this much time. So how does that show up? If the buyer owes, it's an expense to the buyer. How does it show up on the closing statement? It's going to be a debit to the buyer. How will it show up on the seller's side of the closing statement? Buyer owes the seller. It's going to show up as a credit. Okay? Very good. All right, second time through these slides. Certain costs are prorated, divided between the buyer and the seller as of the date of closing. Utilities, property taxes, homeowners association, rents, and so forth. This is about the third or fourth time we've said this now. If the seller paid, calculate the amount owed by the buyer. I hope that makes a little more sense now. If the buyer pays, calculate the amount owed by the seller. So at the closing table, at the closing day, if something was paid by the seller, it was paid in advance. At the closing day, if something is yet to be paid, we're saying that that expense is paid in arrears. Advance means before, and arrears means after. So the party that pays will always get a credit. The party that paid initially paid the expense. The seller paid in advance, get a credit. If the buyer pays in arrears, they get a credit. Whoever is owed money gets a credit. The prorated amount is always going to be an equal amount. Okay, this is another one of those concepts that is a little bit challenging sometimes to get my head around. It doesn't matter what the total bill was. All that matters is how much is owed by one party to the other. So in the examples that we showed, the example I just wrote minutes ago, the buyer owed the seller money because the seller paid in advance. So let's say the amount to be prorated is $100 or $50. So the debit to the buyer, because buyer owed the seller in my drawing, would be $50. And the credit to the seller would be the $50. So a $50 debit to the buyer and a $50 credit to the seller in the example that I drew up a few moments ago. Okay, so if the seller owes property taxes, let's say, to the buyer. Let's do it the other way. Buyer gets stuck paying property taxes, of which that portion of the month, the seller occupied the property for $50 worth, so many days, so many dollars a day. So now the seller owes the property taxes because the property taxes are paid in arrears by the buyer. So we would debit the seller. If the buyer pays, buyer pays, seller owes the buyer. If the buyer pays, the seller owes the buyer. And it'd be the same amount. Seller owes $50, debit buyer $50, credit debit seller $50, credit buyer $50. Seller owes the buyer, debit seller $50, credit buyer $50. Doesn't matter what the whole bill was. All that matters is how much does somebody owe. And whatever somebody owes, it's going to be a debit to that person, and it's going to have an offsetting equal credit to the other person. Doesn't matter what the whole tax bill was. Only thing that matters is how much the party owes. The party that owes will be debited, and the party that receives will be credited the same amount. Okay? So we've got more examples here coming up shortly. The prorated amount will always be an equal amount. The debit to one party will equal the credit to the other party. Rent will be prorated, but security deposits will not. We're kind of getting down to slicing hairs here, but this could be important. So what happens at the closing table, if you buy an investment property, you get the remainder of the month's rent. So if they've paid the rent to the seller of the rental property, and you buy it in the middle of the month, you're going to get a half month's worth of rent. But you get the full security deposits. If the landlord, the owner, had charged security deposits, they just transfer over to the buyer in full. All right? So it's always kind of fun when I used to buy a rental property. You get, you pay for it, but you get this check depending on how big the property is. If it's a fourplex with 4 units, you get a $4,000 worth of security deposit. If the security deposit is of $1,000 a unit. All right. Same thing we've seen before. Let's take a look at it again. So here's our proration time frame. Could be a year, could be a month in your life. A lot of these questions are done by the month. Could be a year, it doesn't matter. All right, so what we've got is we got a time frame, and we've got a seller's time and a buyer's time. So time is moving this way. All right, so I back up again. Time is moving this way. So this is the past, and this is the future, and the day of closing is the present. Okay? So here you go. Until the day of closing, the seller owns the property for this much time. Whoever owns the day of closing, that's when if the seller owns the day of closing, the buyer begins their ownership the day after closing. If the buyer gets the day of closing, then the buyer's ownership begins the day of closing. Just a pattern of what practice is. And time moves this way. So this is the buyer's time, number of days, let's say. This is the seller's time, number of days, let's say. This represents the seller paying something. So when the seller paid something in advance, let's just say, what would we pay in advance from the seller's perspective? Let's just say there's a trash hauling service, and the trash hauling service says you got to pay in advance. All right, so get our money front for the month and we'll come on these appointed days. Okay, so the seller pays this, and this line is meant to say that was for this entire period. Let's say it's a month. That was for the entire period. Well, if the seller paid, what's going to happen at closing? Seller paid, so who owes who? Seller paid, so the buyer owes the seller. Seller paid, so the buyer owes the seller. Now, when the seller pays, we say it was paid in advance of the closing day, before the closing day. All righty? Buyer owes the seller, so how does that show up on the closing statement? If the buyer owes the seller, how is it going to show up on the closing statement? We're going to debit the buyer, we're going to credit the seller. So if the question says how much, well, then we have to do some math. We got to calculate how much the buyer owes the seller. Number of days by times the expense per day will tell us how much the buyer owes the seller, and vice versa. If the buyer pays something and it occurs after closing, this is the closing date in the middle, that payment, let's say the buyer has to pay the trash bill, because in this particular closing, the trash hauler bills in arrears after they've picked up trash for the month. Buyer gets stuck paying the tab for the whole month. So if the buyer paid, who owes who? The buyer paid, who owes who? Well, obviously the seller owes the buyer for this many days. So how does that show up on the closing statement? Seller owes buyer. Seller owes buyer. It's going to be a debit to the seller and a credit to the buyer. Seller owes buyer. Debit seller, credit buyer. How much? Well, then we'd have to solve for this side of the equation. How many days did the seller own the property, or months, whatever it is? And that's going to be then times the expense per day, or times the expense per month if it's an annual proration. To calculate the proration amount, you take the amount divided by the number of days in the billing period. Could be a month, could be a year. Let's say it's a month for our examples. All right, so we take whatever was paid. Let's say the buyer paid. Buyer paid $300. It's a 30-day month. How much is it per day? Buyer paid $300. Buyer paid a bill. $300. Closing day was there. Buyer had to pay in arrears. 30-day month. What's the charge per day? Buyer paid $300. Divide 300 divided by 30, and I think, help me out on the math, gang, isn't that $10 a day? 10 times 30 equals 300. So if we figure out that the seller owned the property for 15 days, buyer paid, seller owned the property for 15 days, seller owes the buyer because the buyer paid, how much? 15 days times $10 a day, $150. How does it show up on the closing statement? Seller owes buyer. Seller owes. Debit the seller, credit the buyer. Bam! Proration. On the national exam is where you'll potentially bump into math questions. So the question's going to have to tell you what protocol to use. And they're going to say use a 360-day or use a 365-day year. So how are they telling you if they say use a 360-day year? Now you might go, wait a minute. There's not 360 days in a year, but sometimes for business purposes there is. Keeps things nice and simple. 360-day year means every month has 30 days. If they say use a 365-day year, you need to know how many days are in each month. The question will have to tell you that. So the question's going to have to tell you, how many days are in the proration period. And they might say use a 30-day month. They might say use a 360-day year. Then you have to interpret that it's a 30-day month. If they say use a 365-day year, you have to know how many days are in each month. The question will also have to tell you who is responsible for the day of closing. Okay, so they give you that information, and then, of course, always complete the proration using the information given in the exam. Now, so how do I remember how many days are in a month if they say use a 365-day year? Well, there's two ways to know this. One is I'm comfortable with. It's the jingle, because that's how I learned it way, way back when I was in grade school. The jingle. Here it goes. You may need to replay this a few times so you can maybe write it down or try to memorize it. 30 days has September, April, June, and November. That part again. 30 days has September, April, June, and November. Third time. 30 days has September, April, June, and November. All the rest have 31 except February, which has 28 or 29 in a leap year. I don't think they'll use leap year on your exam. 30 has September, April, June. All the rest have 31 except February, which has 28 and 29 in a leap year. I'm comfortable with that. Then somebody taught me this method, the Knuckle Method. This gives me anxiety. All right, so here we go. The summit of Knuckle is a 31-day month. The valley of a Knuckle, not a 31-day month. January, 31. February, not 31, 28. March, 31. April, not 31, in the valley. Okay. May, 31. June, 30. And here's why it works. July 31, August 31. Two 31ers right next to each other. August, September, October, November, December, and you got room for scratch paper or something. So that's one way. Makes me anxious. Then a woman in class said, "We don't need to use two hands." I'm like, geez, it's hard enough. She goes, "Oh, just count that knuckle twice. January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December." So whatever method you use, go for it. But be able to figure out how many days are in each month, because we might need to for the exam. Okay, our first proration practice. Investment property closed on June 20th, with the seller owning the day of closing. The $60 trash bill for the month was paid in advance by the seller. How will it be prorated at closing? Well, we're going to find out shortly, but I want to just review what we've learned so far. Something paid in advance, and in our business that means it was paid by the seller, and that seller payment was for the entire month. How many days are in June? 30 days has September, April, June, and November. So there's 30 days. How many days does the seller own the property? Seller owns the property day of closing. Boom. Seller owns the property for 20 days, which means the buyer owned the property for 10 days. All right, we're going to see it again right here. The seller paid for the entire month. The buyer owes the portion from the 21st to the 30th. To find the days the buyer owes, subtract the total days in the period from the seller's last day. So we knew from before, I had that graph done, right? We had a closing, 20 and 10 out of the 30-day month. There it is, hard copy. We know it's a 30-day month. 30 days have September, April, June, and November. We close on the 20th. Day of closing goes to the seller. That means the seller owns the property for 20 days. Take 30 days, subtract 20 days, and you get 10 days that the buyer owned the property. There it is. So, seller paid, who owes who? Seller paid, who owes? Oh, the buyer owes. How much? 10 days worth of trash. Now we got to calculate what 10 days worth of trash is going to cost us. The formula is always the same. Take the amount that was paid, the total amount, in our case, what was it, $60? Divide it by the total days in the month. So that's going to be 60 divided by 30. You can see it right here. Then multiply by the number of days owed. Well, we calculated the buyer owes 10 days. $60 divided by 30 days is just $2 a day for your trash service. How many days does the buyer owe? The buyer owes 10 days. So the buyer owes $20 of the $60. So how does it show up on the closing statement? The buyer owes 20. The buyer owes 20. Expenses are debits to somebody. So the buyer owes, the buyer's expensed $20. We show a debit buyer, and it's an equal credit to the seller. Buyer pays their fair share to the seller. Debit buyer, credit seller. Big side, little side. Big side versus little side. Less than half versus more than half. Some proration problems may be solved without having to do the math. This might sound crazy to you, but sometimes you can figure out the answer just by knowing really two things. Who's supposed to be debited, and is it more than half or is it less than half of the entire expense? In our example, the buyer owed less than half of $60 because they closed on the 20th. So the buyer didn't owe half. The buyer owed less than half. And there might just be one answer on the exam. One of the four answers the only one might be where the buyer owes less than half and the seller is credited less than half. That's doing this thing by just looking at it. And sometimes in courses, follow-up courses to licensing courses, people have told me, yeah, I was able to figure out the proration without even using my calculator because I used the more than half, less than half methodology. So in the previous problem, the buyer owed debit less than half of $60. So we look at the answers and say, is there an answer that shows debiting the buyer less than half of the $60 charge and provides an equal credit for the seller? If there's only one option that has less than half of 60, debit buyer, credit seller, that's got to be the answer. So there again it is, right? The big side versus little side, less than half versus more than half. We know the seller paid the entire bill, and that was for the entire period. We know the buyer owes the seller, so we know it's going to be a debit buyer, credit seller. And we know it's going to be less than half of $60. Because $60 was for the whole month, and had they closed in the middle of the month, the buyer would owe right around half, $30. But because they closed in the latter half of the month, we know the buyer owes less than half to the seller. And if there's only one answer that shows debit buyer, credit seller, less than half, it's got to be the right answer if there's only one answer that shows such a thing. So an investment property is being closed on June 20th, with the seller having the day of closing. The water bill for the month was paid in advance. How will it be paid at closing? All right, very good. Here are the potential answers. Debit the buyer 40, credit the seller 40. Go back. And it's hard having it on two slides, so I'm going to see if I can help you out with that. So who who owes who? The seller paid, the water bill for the month was paid in advance. All right, so we got the seller, we got the buyer. It was paid in advance by the seller. That's for the entire month. They close on the 20th. And who gets what? The day of closing goes to the seller. So the seller owned for 20 days and the buyer owned for 10 days. So seller paid 60. Buyer owes 10 days worth of 60, which is less than half of 60. So the buyer owes less than half. The buyer owes less than half. The buyer owes less than half. The amount is $60 of the proration. $60. And we're looking for something that is less than half. We know the buyer owes less than half. So debit buyer 40, boom, out. Get out of here. Why? 40 bucks is more than half of 60. Done, move on, eliminated from consideration. Credit seller 20, debit buyer 20. Debit buyer less than half. Credit seller less than half. It's in play. Let's just see if there's anything else. Debit seller 40, credit buyer 40. That makes no sense. The seller paid. Why would we debit the seller? That's out. A is out. C is out. Credit buyer. Out. We know it's a debit buyer. Bing, bang, boom. No math. Which one's right? Letter B. There's no need to do the math. The question states the buyer owed the seller, so it's going to be a debit buyer, credit seller, less than half of the expense, and only one of our choices showed a buyer debit and a seller credit less than half of the $60. No math.